So now I'd like to formally introduce Bryan King, who is an architect that has been exclusively designing veterinary hospitals, clinics, pet resorts, animal shelters and pounds since 2002. As a practicing architect in the USA since 1990, Bryan has a broad base of experience in project development. He joined Therian in 2018 as the design manager after 13 years with one of the largest nationally acclaimed US animal architecture firms and subsequent years of independent consulting in the industry. In his role as the design manager for Therian, Bryan applies his experience with companion animal design to every commissioned project, both large and small. Thank you, Bryan.
Thank you. Find my clicker here. So it's great to follow Trish because she gave a nice introduction to Fear-Free for what I'm going to be walking through with you. So before I knew what Trish was going to be talking about in front of me, I wanted to survey the room and see, first of all, what is Fear-Free? How many people have heard of Fear-Free before? Okay, now how many have heard of Fear-Free before the last half hour? Okay, well, that's great, impressive, and not exactly what I expected to find out, so I'm pleased. So, real quick rundown for the few in the room that hadn't heard of Fear-Free or don't know what it might entail. So, Fear-Free was started in the USA about 5 years ago by Dr. Marty Becker. And it really took hold in the veterinary profession first. So these are the different components of, or the different Fear-Free programs that exist to date. So they started Fear-Free focusing on practicing veterinarians, moved into certification for practices, and then have expanded into more animal care professionals. And as of the 22nd of August of this year, now there's certified Fear-Free shelters or a Fear-Free shelter program. So I think Trish gave a good introduction to what it's about, but taking these 4 core areas and learning really how to handle, how to identify fear in animals that are in your care. That's the core of it. Where I come in as an architect is looking at it from a little different angle, which is how do we design shelter environments to reduce stress or make them more fear-free. This isn't part of their training program. This is just, to me, good practice. So I started as the introduction was provided back in 2002, and at the time Larry Gates and Mark Hafen were the architects that mentored me, and it's really, they were the ones that got me interested in animal shelter design, animal care specialization, and it really was their inspiration of, you know, trying to make shelters less stressful. That's what really got me excited about architecture. You know, like so many of us when we're young, and this is rampant in the architecture profession, is we get out of uni and we are very idealistic. We're going to change the world, you know. And after many years of designing strip malls and doing things that were not all that satisfying, I met Larry and Mark, and they were really passionate about what they did. And they felt that they were helping animals through architecture and making more stress-free environments. So we've been doing this for years. It's now branded by Dr. Marty Becker. Thank you very much. But it is important to make environments that help facilitate lower stress and less fear in your shelters. So there's lots of different things that we can do, but what I wanted to focus on today is 3 aspects of creating appropriate separation and what's important. So it's really visual separation, the sounds and the smells within the shelter environment. I'll never forget a shocking shelter that I visited. It's probably almost 15 years ago now in Pittsburgh. And the cat quarantine area, the only way to access it was through walking through the dog kennels and, the gauntlet. Cats had to be carried straight past all of these, just dogs just completely going off. And once you got into that cat quarantine room, you could still hear them. You could still hear the dogs barking right outside the room. And the cats that didn't have to, or didn't end up in that, little individual cat hell, there were other areas in the shelter where they were just housed, in cages on the floor in hallways, where they would have dogs walking past on leads and that type of environment. Well, they reported that they had 100% URI infection rate within that shelter environment. As we heard yesterday, key risk factors for feline calicivirus, feline herpes virus, stress, close quarters, overcrowding. They had all of it going on. And, we need to look for those things in shelters and eliminate them and design new spaces that are better and don't have those types of environments. So one thing that, in Australia, it's great that we design around is campuses. So I think of a lot of, shelter design as kind of like campus design. So looking at, I like these two examples of these huge corporate centers. So, the Apple Park, the spaceship, whatever you want to call it, it's a 260,000 square meter building. Single building, this huge, ring, all one structure. They have about 12,000 employees in there. Similarly, the Googleplex, similar size, similar number of employees. But if you look at these two examples, they are very different responses from an architectural design standpoint. Apple Park, like I said, one big building. And if you look at the Googleplex, you can see distinctly about 5 different main building areas interconnected by walkways and covered internal areas, and a much more friendly campus type design. I remember when I went to university, University of Illinois at the time was about 60,000 students, and pretty sizable university. And I came from a really small, high school. There were 600 in my high school, and about 150 in my graduating class. But I was lucky that in the architecture program, the architecture school itself, 150 in my class. So it felt okay because I had a small group that that I felt as my community within this mass of 60,000 students. So anyway, think about, shelter design from the standpoint of how do you divide it up into smaller pieces, break it up. So an example on a actual shelter design here in Australia, looking at is how do you quantify these separate buildings? So the important thing is, define the functions first and figure out how those different functions can be defined by separate buildings. So it's pretty obvious, should be. Separate areas for public access, adoptions, quarantine animals, healthy hold animals, isolation animals, and certainly separating dogs from cats and other species. So in this example, you can kind of see, I didn't label every single building, but each of these are kind of freestanding buildings. You're fortunate in most of Australia to have pretty temperate climate, so you can allow for a lot of the circulation space that happens, in buildings or between areas to occur outside. This solution also lends itself to a lot of natural ventilation and trying to minimize the use of air conditioning when you don't have to. In the U.S., the trend is really, that it just tend to be massive buildings, all indoor, and you can still create the separation, but anyway, I think here in Australia, this type of solution is a much better approach. So starting with the three types of separation, the visual separation. So first of all, the easy thing, eliminate direct line of sight especially between different species in all areas. And think about all of the different areas of the shelter. So if there's intake or adoption areas, think about how those are going to be separate than just the direct housing areas. And then within the species, avoid placing dog pens facing each other. Seems obvious, but for space reasons, sometimes that can be a challenge. Think about hotels. Every hotel you go into, double-loaded hallways with rooms on both sides. There's a reason. It's the most efficient solution, so we have to find ways to break that down. Cat housing, if you are faced with putting opposing cat housing in a single space, make sure there's at least about 1.5 to 1.8 meters in between them to de-stress that environment for the cats. Other things, using gates or doors with solid bottoms. Now, I take on board what Trish is saying about the solitary confinement, and as I noted here, that can be a little problematic. That not all dogs are going to react well to being in a kennel with a solid bottom door. So that should be a fallback position, not the go-to solution. A better solution is utilizing partial height walls that are outside beyond the gate, beyond the actual kennel pen. And also creating that environments where dogs and cats can hide, like we just heard from Trish as well. So outward-facing kennels reduces barrier aggression, reduces barking. So these are those types of outdoor type kennel buildings, shed buildings, open air. And then on the image on the left, you can see right outside those kennels, there's a low wall, a low kind of fence that's running along there that prevents dogs from seeing out into those yards. Okay, and then think about the gate selection and the influence it has on the behavior. I'm a firm believer that glass fronted gates actually result in a different behavior than the wire or the chain mesh gates. Dogs perceive it differently. They don't bark as much. They view it more like a home environment than when you put them in a prison, a wire gate type solution. So really prefer that as a solution. Auditory separation. So like I said with those cats in the Pittsburgh shelter that I was in, hearing those dogs barking all the time is a huge stress factor for them. So the campus type solution helps with this issue also, providing that physical separation between the buildings to help decrease any noise transfer. Limiting the number of dogs, I put in here 12 to 15 in any one area. Ideally probably 8 to 10, but just as shelters grow quite large, sometimes that, they push up to the 12 to 15, but try to minimize the dogs in one area. Also helps with disease control management issues, in addition to just trying to keep the noise at a reasonable level. And fully enclosing areas with at least 2 doors separating the space so that when you open one door, the noise doesn't travel directly into the adjacent space. So think about how open doors are going to affect noise transfer between spaces. And then also addressing sound absorbing materials. Appropriate materials. So there's 2 types of sound control, real quick. There's what we refer to as sound transmission class. That's a rating that applies to noise being transferred from one space into the next space. So big, thick, heavy materials with a lot of mass usually create better sound transmission ratings. And then there's noise reduction coefficients. And that's a measure of how much sound a material absorbs. So within the space, trying to bring the noise level down. The one thing I would point out about noise absorbing materials is anything that absorbs noise usually absorbs water. So you have to keep those materials up high. I really recommend, acoustic type ceiling treatments to help with noise levels in kennel areas, and then wall panels. So in this photo that I've got up, all of those panels that you see up high on the wall, those kind of metal mesh panels, all have an insulation material within it that absorbs noise, but everything is up high. So the upper part of the walls and the ceilings. Okay, excuse me. And then odor. How do you prevent the odors? Again, same type of thing. That physical separation, creating those separate buildings, but also keeping the air exhaust rates, air exchange rates elevated. So around 8 to 12 air changes per hour is beneficial for the health of the animals, and it should be 100% exhaust air. So definitely between species, you would never want to take air from a dog kennel and recycle that air into the cat kennel. There are instances in small shelters where sometimes for energy efficiency reasons, we may need to do some recycled air within dog areas, but it shouldn't be. It should be 100% exhaust air and then bring fresh air in. Helps control disease, odor, and just keep the odor levels down to minimize stress. Some of the points I hit on there. So another key is trying to circulate the air from the public areas through the animal pens, through the animal holding areas, and then exhaust it out. Maximize the amount of air that's flowing through the animal area. It helps minimize the odor also in the public or the staff working areas, so that your eyes aren't watering when you go in there. We've all been in, I think, some pretty rough shelters and experienced more odor than we should. So trying to do that, whether it's ventilated cat cages or just good mechanical systems with directional airflow. My advice really is also don't rely on filtration to control odor. Filters are just horrible to maintain. They don't get maintained. There's the expense and the hassle of dealing with heavy filtration. It's a lot easier to just exhaust air, get the bad air out, and bring fresh air in. And there's ways that we can do it. So anyway, the point really is for me that low stress and fear-free type shelter environments will improve your outcomes. They improve the behavior of your animals. It results in higher adoption rates, animals that are better behaved when they're in your care, and there you go. Everybody's happy at the end of the day. So anyway, thank you all for your time.